Hello, my name's Phil Dustin. I'm a marine ecologist. I've been a professor at the College of Charleston for about 40 years, and I have studied the waterways and the estuaries and in general, the interrelationship between the land and the sea in Charleston for about 35 or 40 years. And I'd like to put this commentary down on what I think of as the ecological repercussions or the impacts of the proposed I-526 Mark Clark extension that would go from West Ashley across Johns Island onto James Island and join up with the James Island connector. When we think about it, we think about, oh, this great road with no other cars on it, we'll zip into town, but the picture is really a little more foggy than that. In general, when we look at Charleston from a satellite image, we can see from high above the developed land appears bright reflective white, whereas the undeveloped vegetation is red in this false color rendering. And so we can begin to see that we have Charleston Peninsula and the three rivers that come into it, essentially the Wando, the Cooper, and the Ashley River, and then the Stono a little bit to the southwest of that. Another way to look at Charleston is what we call a dot density map. And this image the data are taken from the 1990 census. We can see that Charleston really is a dense urban area surrounded by about 1 million acres of pretty sparsely populated land if each dot is 50 people. I was part of the Charleston Harbor Project, which was a project to try to understand human impacts on the area of Charleston Harbor that included the three rivers and the harbor and the nearshore environment. And one of the things that came out of that is we have intense pressure from urbanization, and that's driving the contamination of estuarine creeks. And Fred Holland and his group from DNR showed that when we got to about 5% impervious surface of the watershed for these creeks, we began to see changes. And at about 30%, it became damaging. We saw loss of species, loss of productivity, silting in with muds, and all kinds of various damaging processes that basically interrupt the ecology of that estuary. I have been interested in Johns Island because I live on Johns Island. And if we look at Johns Island, we see that in 1996, with this satellite image, it was a relatively sparsely covered area. We had lots of farmlands, and we can see that it's bounded by two rivers. The Stono River, which starts at the Atlantic Ocean and ends in Wadmalaw Sound, and at Bohicket Creek, which really isn't a river, it's a creek, but you could call it a river. So that's what makes Johns Island, Johns Island. Another way to look at Johns Island is in a thematic mapper, not a thematic mapper, a LiDAR image, which is a digital elevation map that shows Johns Island is really a series of dune-like structures that run parallel to the coast, these red colored areas which depict high ground, with the highest on Johns Island being about 25 feet, and grading down to sea level. And you can see here this really intimate intergrading of the land and the sea, and this is what is very characteristic of the low country. Now we think of our salt marshes as precious, and they really are. They're nursery grounds for virtually all the commercial and recreational important fisheries that we have, birds, turtles, mammals, you name it. They have very important ecological functions too. We have very high productivity, and the plants that live there tend to purify the environment. And the grasses trap sediment, and we actually sort of have this almost building of land as the marsh fills in with fine sediments. And of course we like to go fishing in these areas, and we get shrimp and fish and different shellfish and things like that. The Stono River is a really interesting river because it is basically a tidal river between Wadmalaw Sound and the Atlantic Ocean. And it is classified as shellfish collecting habitat. That means the water is very, very clean. And the area, for the most part, is not impaired with fecal coliform, but we're finding that that's happening more and more as development is occurring and we're getting big rainfalls. And fecal coliform, you may know or not know, is the bacterial contamination from human waste and from animal waste. Now, the thing that makes the Stono River so interesting is that it is pretty much sensitive to water runoff from the land. It's very sensitive to non-point source inputs, as opposed to an upland water source. There is no upland water flow into the Stono River. It's all basically tidal and rainfall. When we sort of superimpose the LiDAR image and an image showing where people live and showing the habitation of it, which is essentially a true color image, you can begin to see the roads. For example, this area here is Maybank Highway, and there's a lot of development on Maybank Highway. There's a dune to the north of it, and we can see quite a bit of development there, and another one here. Very little development in and around these low areas where we have the estuarine creeks. Same thing on the what I call the airport dune, which stretches from the Johns Island Airport all the way across to Bohicket Creek. And in this area here, we have the Burden Creek Basin. And the people that settled on Johns Island were no fools. They built their houses, for the most part, and their roads on these high bits of high ground, and then they farmed in the middle. And as time has taken its course, what we're seeing is more and more development is occurring in these low-lying areas. And that's resulted in all kinds of different urban floodings and changes to our watersheds. This is the land that's within the urban growth boundary, which is available for development by the city. And you can begin to see these open areas, for example, this area down in here, this area by the airport, some of these other areas. When we superimpose this on top of the LiDAR image, what we begin to see is that there's not a whole lot of room left for development that's high ground. In other words, coming down Maybank Highway, there's quite a bit of land that's already been developed. But these open spaces here and these open spaces in here tend to be on lower grounds. And in fact, as time has taken its course since this image was done in 2006, we've seen this whole area down here along River Road become filled in with development or potential development. We've seen the Cane-Slash Road become filled in, and we've seen over here these areas also become filled in with development. And it's resulted in a ballooning in the population of Johns Island within the city, and also a dramatic increase in urban flooding caused by this development. When we think about the I-526 Mark Clark extension, we have to begin to ask, where is it going to go? And the original plan, which looks like the most recent plan as well, starts at Citadel Mall, comes across some low-lying marsh, crosses Maybank Highway, and then makes another bend, goes across the Stono River again, paralleling in along James Island County Park, and then curving and sort of running parallel to James Island Creek here, or Ellis Creek, and essentially terminating at the end of the James Island Connector. And from there, this traffic will zoom into the city of Charleston and end up somewhere in here, dumping into Calhoun Street, creating probably the county's largest traffic jam along this road. But anyway, this is the route that it's going to take, and I'd like to take each one of these sections and talk. So coming out of Citadel Mall, we're going to cut across a neighborhood. You can see there's Boeing Avenue and Swift Shore and Douglas Avenue and Beechcraft and Cessna. This is area named, probably developed by somebody that was really interested in airplanes, Piper Lane and things like that. And it will cut right through that area, across this marsh, clipping the edge of Headquarters Island, and then coming in and landing somewhere in Maybank Highway in here, crossing Maybank Highway, coming down probably along this right-of-way for power line, and then crossing across the Stono River once again, running alongside James Island, and then ending at where the so it will essentially parallel Central Park and come in somewhere around here. So when we think of that, it provides a big loop that comes from 17, across James Island, and ends up back again, very close to 17, but at Calhoun Street, with only a very small way to get from where it's coming in over to the crosstown. So it's really not a beltway by any stretch of the imagination. It's sort of a big one-way road in and out of Charleston. And coming and going on to Johns Island presently, we have the Limehouse Bridge and the Stono Bridge at Maybank, and then the James Island Connector. So we have these three bridges, and I decided early on to try to have a look at these bridges as a way of trying to understand what building this connector would do to Johns Island. So I started a little study of just going around and looking under the bridges and trying to understand the impact of bridges on the local ecology. And so I'm going to first take the Limehouse Bridge, which is a big, tall bridge. It replaced a swing bridge for the intercoastal waterway. And it goes across from the Stono River, across the Stono River to West Ashley from Johns Island. And it's a tidal river. You can see the change in the tide here with the oyster line. And leading up to it, it comes across Johns Island and slowly rises. It's got quite a bit of space to increase its elevation. And when you begin to look at it, you see that there are these big storm drains that hang over the river. And so we have this large concrete structure that has many cars going over it, and it drains directly into the Stono River, which is clean enough to collect shellfish you can eat out of. And along the roadway, same thing as it goes across the marsh, we have these storm drains as well. And as we get under the lower parts of the bridge, we realize that the bridge shades the marsh. So not only does the freshwater runoff from the bridge dump directly into the marsh, we have this shading effect that tends to sort of limit the growth of the Spartina grass, the marsh grass underneath. And of course that runoff goes directly into the marsh via these little rivulets, where there are oysters living very close to that area, and the Spartina marsh. And in the high tide, when these areas fill up with high tide water, we have larger fish that come in here and forage on the animals that live in the marsh. So let's have a look under the Maybank Bridge, which goes over the Stono River. And the first thing you realize when you walk along the side of it is there's road trash everywhere. And there's reduced plant life in the shadow along it as well. There's a well-defined edge that seems to reduce the growth of plants and maybe attract the amount of trash that's there. The shadow effect gets pretty severe as the bridge drops down. And when you go underneath, there's basically an ecological dead zone. Just sort of the remnants of what's coming out of the road. And you can see these drains right here that dump right into this area. And this area is tidal. On high tides, this area floods. So we have these roadway drains. We get these erosion channels, and it drains off into the marsh. You get little pools forming, which are great for mosquitoes and other kinds of animals. And of course, wildlife is attracted into those pools as well. And again, here we have that drain and runoff from the road water running directly into the marsh. So the higher the bridge, the bigger the shadow. Now let's look at the James Island Connector, because that goes into town. That's the largest of these bridges. And again, there's this shadow along the edge, and there's this constant drip of water from these drain holes right along in here. And the other thing that happens is we have all these nice little perches for predatory birds now. So what we've done is essentially slice right through the marsh and create an avenue for cars to drive over, but underneath we have predators, and then we have this water flowing off the bridges and into the marsh. When we get to Harborview Road, we actually pull off the road and take a look underneath the connector and have a look and try to walk around and see what that looks like as well. And the connector joins up. There's a pretty complex area, and then in the middle there's quite a bit of marsh that sits there. And that marsh has drains underneath, that exit out to the marsh. And again, the same sort of trash that blows out of pickup trucks and people throw out of their cars. And, it's just amazing how careless people can be. And when you go underneath this large area of concrete, it's like walking into the catacombs. There's virtually no plant life underneath. There's a tremendous amount of water and muck, and as you'll see, there's some small animals that live around there as well. Another view of it down in here, we get these little depressions that form at the bases of these columns, and sometimes we'll see snails. You see these little dots, those are snails living around that area. This is obviously an area where raccoons like to come and hunt, because you can see their claw marks right here. And these are the holes of various kinds of little crabs, little fiddler crabs and other organisms that burrow into the mud and live in the soft mud, while the snails live on the surface. And we have oysters along the sides here attached to the pillars. This happens to be the paw print of a bobcat or a very large house cat. But so what we're seeing is we have animals that are coming. We have predatory birds, predatory mammals that come down here for the food that's here to forage. And when I first got under the bridge, I looked up and I thought, oh, they put skylights here. And then I realized over the roadway there are no skylights because they're drains. They have electric lights here to light the road, but they don't have water dripping on the road because that would be a hazard for the road. But notice there's a very large patch here of asphalt from the water running off into this area. There's this outwash, I call it outwash delta from the Harborview Road runoff, and with it the associated amount of trash that comes with it and roadway pollution that flows into Charleston Harbor and James Island Creek. And car garbage is everywhere. We have contractor waste, we have waste from people eating lunches, cigarette butts everywhere. Just carelessness from people. And remember, all of this runoff drains directly into the marsh. This is a view looking towards the Ashley River, and you can see right in here, there's high tide, and here's the high tide mark right in here. So whatever ends up in this area will eventually get washed out to sea, or dissolved at least, by salt water that comes and goes with the tide. So this seems to be the wrong way to set up a drainage system that results in draining water from the road and people's garbage into waterways that we value, places where we go fishing and shrimping and swimming. Doesn't seem like the right way to build a road. So after I visited the bridges, I started to try to understand, so what about roads? What about roadways, and what do roadways do? And this happens to be River Road on Johns Island in the springtime with the beautiful azaleas and the live oak trees. And you think about these roads as being beautiful, pastoral sort of roads we drive our cars down. On a nice day we might take the top down if we have a convertible. Just really pleasant roads. But they're also the lifeline of business and people's lives, and the roadways for emergency traffic as well. So in looking at the biological impact of roads, we find out that there's a lot of pollution that roads generate. There's a lot of roadkill. They form barriers that reduce the dispersal of organisms. They cause vibrations on the ground that will disrupt the life of organisms that live in the ground. And they create a lot of noise. So roads aren't just necessarily nice, benign things to drive down on a Sunday afternoon. The first idea I want to get across to you is this idea of a roadway corridor. In other words, a road is not just the width of the road. The impact of the road has to do with, depending upon whether it's upslope or downslope, upwind, less wind, and what kind of habitat is around it. So for example, a road can actually have an impact of up to a kilometer on either side of that road in terms of the amount of pollution that it generates. And I'll go through some of these just a little bit at a time. And this comes from a really interesting annual review in Ecology and Systematics called Roads and Their Major Ecological Effects by Richard Foreman and Lauren Alexander from Harvard. And I thoroughly recommend you dig it out of the library and read it if you're interested in this. So roadways are necessarily, when we think of the roadway, we think of the width for animals, like grass shrimp that live around roadways within 100 meters of a road will show reduced reproduction in a marsh. Birds don't like to nest within a quarter of a mile because of the noise. Roadway corridors increase availability for nest predators to fly along the road and then go off. So nest predators have about a 600-meter increased corridor for nest predation. Songbirds sort of like to live at about the level of noise you have in a library. And when that noise gets to 42 decibels, which begins to get above library noise, that reduces their reproduction. Earthworms that live along the sides of roads, when the ground vibrates, they will come out of the ground. And there'll be more animals feeding on them. And large mammals tend to avoid roads simply because of the noise. But they also get killed crossing roads. So when we take I-526 extension and we talk about the amount of habitat that's going to be lost from it, if we look in terms of how much we're going to miss in terms of acres, the road itself is about 75 acres. But if we have a 100-meter swath through that area, it's about 650. But if we think of the impact of that road in terms of a 1-kilometer path, it's about 3,270 acres. So when we talk about this road being only 75 acres, or maybe only 24 acres of marsh, its impact is much larger than that and should be considered. In the United States, around 2005, 2006, there were over 1 million vertebrates killed per day on the roads in the United States. And ironically, South Carolina, its area in the United States is about 1% of the United States, which is about the amount of paved road area we have in the entire United States. So high-speed roads kill birds and small mammals. 2-lane roads that are high-speed kill large and mid-sized mammals. And 2-lane roads in general kill amphibians and reptiles. Things like frogs and snakes and turtles. So on River Road, for a year, I kept a record driving from Burden Creek to Maybank Highway every day. I kept a record of the kind of roadkill I saw in that 2.5 miles of road. And 26 raccoons, 14 possums, 3 deer, 1 fox, 2 snakes, 3 dogs, 2 cats, 51 animals. That's probably, in talking to friends of mine that jog along the road, that's probably on the order of 25 to 40%. Maybe, and there are a lot of animals, especially deer, that get hit, that run away and die in the woods. So if you sort of take that and sum it up to the length of River Road, it's about 350 animals a year. And that's when there was less traffic. Remember, that's 15 years ago. Now the next thing to look at is the pollution that comes out of automobiles. And gasoline vehicle exhaust emits about 1,000 different kinds of pollutants. Benzene, carbon monoxide, various nitrogenous compounds, ozone, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, PAHs, and many more, and heavy metals such as cadmium, zinc, chromium, and nickel. So the exhaust fume causes air pollution, and that air pollution will cause cancer. We used to have a lot of lead poisoning, which we don't have now, but it also causes a lot of bronchial and respiratory illnesses, especially in small children. And this doesn't even talk about what comes off car tires. When we look at diesels, they have about 450 kinds of compounds that come out of them. And some people say diesels are less polluting, but diesels actually probably kill more people because they emit very, very fine particulate carbon that gets into people's lungs. And so it's suggested by the American Lung Association that about 60,000 people a year have premature deaths annually because of diesel exhaust. So the next thing we look at is what happens with urban rainfall. It rains on roads just as it does in the forest. And some studies that have been done in various areas have looked at this and said, okay, if we look at I-10 near Baton Rouge, we see that the suspended solids coming off of it and the chemical oxygen demand that comes off of it are greater than those found in municipal wastewater treatment plants in the same area. So basically what's coming off a road is a toxic a mix of particles with high chemical oxygen demand. When we start to look at urban roadways, we find out that again, these traffic roadways have zinc and cadmium and copper. We also find lead and iron and aluminum, and then zinc and cadmium and copper are sort of dissolved fractions of that. And most of this comes off in the first flush when it's been dry for a while and then we have a big rainstorm. And we often see that the concentrations of these metals are higher than normal discharge standards for commercial point source discharges. So what about looking at our roadways? We did some sort of very simple small studies in around 2005, 2006, 2007. We looked at the amount of metals that were coming off in the runoff, the first runoff coming with rainwater. So this particular set of unpublished data from, I believe, about 2008 or 9 shows the Harbor View James Island Connector in blue, Stono River Bridge in orange, and rainwater in this darker sort of grayish color. And this is a logarithmic scale in terms of micrograms per mil of the water, going from 0.01 to 10,000. And what we see is, for the most part, the metals, chromium, iron, arsenic, cadmium, lead, are relatively low in the rainwater, but they're higher. Here we actually have zinc in rainwater as well, but we see that here, Harbor View and Stono River Bridge, the same thing here, and same thing here, the same thing here. For the most part, we're seeing an enrichment of these heavy metals. And since this is a logarithmic scale, this is 10 times more manganese. This is almost 100 times more manganese. This is 1,000 times zinc. Is over 1,000 micrograms per mil. When we actually have very, very low concentrations of iron, that's probably from rusting. So what we're seeing is the runoff from the bridges are enriched in these heavy metals. Well, what about the animals that live under the bridges? What about the oysters and the little periwinkle snails that we see all the time? You know, the little rhinids that live down there. So again, grind up the tissue and run it through the analysis. And you see here that some of these animals, and I have to say these controls, the control animals here come from the James Island County Park on the Stono River, a couple miles below where the Maybank Bridge is. But you can see that these areas have higher amounts of iron, higher amounts of copper, higher amounts of zinc. And so what we're seeing is an enrichment in some of these heavy metals in the tissues of these animals. And the same thing with the snails. So these animals that are living in polluted environments are becoming enriched with heavy metals. Now those bridges, the samples here taken under the bridge on the Maybank Bridge, the samples taken under the connector, that water goes directly into, here we have James Island Creek and this large marsh, and here it goes into the marsh and then into the Stono River. So the bridge pollution, the pollution that comes off these bridges, flows directly into the marshes. And whether or not you put some sort of catchment on it, that catchment still, those metals are going to be caught somewhere in this area and through groundwater seeps will somehow get into this environment. unless they are captured and treated and taken away and buried in a toxic landfill. So what about the human health risks of living near roads? Okay, so these are studies from all around the world, and what we see is stroke mortality increases in England and Wales when you live near roads. You have exposure to materials related to the tires, and it turns out that tires generate the lion's share of microplastic that we see in these areas, because we have millions of miles. In 2015, I believe it was 15 million vehicle miles per day in Charleston County, and those tires wear out, and they have zinc, and they have copper sometimes, and they have other metals in them to keep them from wearing out so fast. We've also seen that people living within, close proximity to road, children have increased wheezing illness in Britain. And wheezing illness is sort of like a precursor to asthma. And people living on busy roads have a higher risk of allergy sensitivities. And we see a lot of allergies in Charleston as well. So what we really need is an increased sensitivity to pollen and air pollutants. In France, 21,000 additional premature deaths per year from respiratory heart diseases. In Austria, Switzerland, and France, more than the total number of annual traffic deaths in these three countries. And in Sweden, they showed that car tires are the main source of small particles, which are cancer-causing. And they've been linked to 10,000 premature deaths in Britain each year from lung and heart disease. So this microplastic that's being generated gets up in the air and wafts around in the air as well. Vehicle mortality in France and Austria and Switzerland and in New Zealand is greater, except in New Zealand, it's greater than people being killed in traffic deaths. So when you drive down a busy road, you're breathing air that has toxic dust in it and fumes. If you're jogging along the side of the road, it's even worse. Cars don't protect drivers from pollution. You're basically driving down a tunnel of pollution. And one of the nice things about having trees on either side is they tend to contain that pollution within that tunnel space and purify the air that gets through their large crowns. So you really want to have a lot of trees lining the roads. And if you're driving down the center of the road, you're basically breathing all these toxic gases coming out of the cars in front of you. So what we see is building the road would be a critical loss of habitat. We'd see a hardening of the watersheds. We'd see the introduction of pollutants into that environment. Those pollutants could lead to reduced larval survivors. And we think of the larvae that are in the marsh as being the larvae of fish that we like to eat, like grouper that live offshore even, and the shrimp, and the various kinds of shellfish that we like to eat that are in the marsh. We see this concentration of these pollutants in the animals of these, and then it's going to end up higher up in the food web as well, as there are other animals that come and dig up those animals and eat them, and then they get eaten by other animals. So we're going to go out fishing and hunting in these areas, and we're going to get those animals, and we'll take them home and eat them, and we're basically eating polluted livestock. So the overall pollution impacts of building another giant road that will have much more traffic on it is going to be the reduction of a large part of the vitality of this environment, with a direct impact on humans that like to shrimp and eat oysters and go fishing in the Stono River. So the arguments for building this road, the first one is, well, you know, it's been on the books for 30, 40 years, and it's going to improve traffic flow between West Ashley and James Island. Well, yes, but the traffic studies really show that it is going to be at capacity within 3 or 4 years. And it's going to lead right into the peninsula of Charleston and create a massive traffic jam. Now, the other argument is, well, we need it for hurricane evacuation. But getting off Jones Island is not an issue about hurricane evacuation. Getting from Johns Island to Columbia or inland is the big issue. Going up 526 or some of these other roads, and that's where the traffic jams have always occurred. Not getting on and off Johns Island. We have plenty of capacity to move the people off Johns Island. Now, even in 2007, Leon Stavronakis said I-526 is not for Johns Island. So people flip-flop, people change their minds. What we haven't really considered is this idea of increasing the amount of development on Johns Island, which we're already seeing. The increase in development decreases the environmental vitality, increases the quality of our lives here, and we're seeing that right now. We're also seeing a dramatic amount of urban flooding, increased traffic. We're also going to see what's called induced traffic as trucks, like trucks going to Bees Ferry Road, like as in garbage trucks from the peninsula, will use this road, and we'll see this idea of induced traffic as this is the de facto route out of town. And that has not been shown in any of the COG models. The BCD COG models show roadway quickly exceeds capacity. And in meetings that I've been involved in, when I've asked where these models come from and what the assumptions of the models are, no one's ever given me an explanation for how the models even work. So I don't trust the models. We're going to see this massive amount of increased roadway pollution, which is going to expose all the neighborhoods on Johns Island. And there are much more efficient and less expensive ways to improve traffic flow and safety without sacrificing Johns Island. We don't even have a good mass transit network at all anywhere on Johns Island. So what we really need to do is think about, is this really what we want? You know, when you go to a doctor's office and you have a problem and you walk in there, the first thing that a doctor thinks of is do no harm. And we should think of the same thing when we build a road like this. When an activity raises threats to harming human health or the environment, we should say it must be shown that this will not hurt anybody, that this will not harm anybody, rather than the flip side of it. The precautionary principle is what we need to apply when we begin to do development projects of this sort. So I-526 expansion poses a major threat to the ecology and the human health of Johns Island, James Island, West Ashley, really disrupt people's lives, make them live essentially in the shadow of pollution. So the question is, you know, where do we go from here? What do we do? And I'd like to, at this point, bring up the idea, we talk about the cost of this roadway as being around $700 million. In reality, it's probably going to be double that. It's going to be an elevated highway. The cost, since the last estimate was calculated, costs have probably almost doubled, maybe tripled. So we're talking about $1 billion, $1.5 billion. And in 2018, the entire tax base valuation, the assessed value of Johns Island, was about $10 billion. So we're being asked to okay the building of a road that's 10% of the value of Johns Island, that is going to be essentially outdated before it's finished, that is going to significantly decrease our quality of life on Johns Island and in West Ashley and on James Island. And you have to ask, why? Why would we ever want to do this? So thanks very much for being patient and listening. And if you'd like to contact me, I can be reached at phil.dustin@gmail.com. Thank you very much.